When a woman is harassed by cops for no reason, her husband, a fellow officer, shows up and delivers justice that leaves everyone speechless. It was a cold autumn evening in a small suburban town when Mia Thompson drove home after a long day at work. She was a nurse, devoted to her patients, and often worked late into the night. Exhausted but relieved to finally head home, she hummed to the soft tunes on the radio. Her thoughts wandered to her husband, Officer Jake Thompson, a decorated police officer well respected in the community. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. As Mia approached a dimly lit intersection, she noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Confused, she glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. There were no signs of traffic violations she could think of. She pulled over, rolling her window down as two officers approached her car. Their expressions were cold, almost dismissive. "License and registration," one of them barked. Mia handed over her documents, her hands trembling slightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, trying to keep calm. The officer ignored her question, instead examining her license with an exaggerated slowness. The second officer leaned against her car door, peering inside as if searching for something suspicious. "Where are you headed at this hour?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "Home," Mia replied, her voice steady but firm. "I just finished my shift at the hospital." The officers exchanged a glance, their demeanor growing more intimidating. "You know, driving around late at night looks suspicious," one of them said, smirking slightly. "Are you sure you're not hiding something?" Mia felt her frustration building. "I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong. Why am I being pulled over?" she questioned. Instead of answering, one of the officers began walking around her car, shining his flashlight into her windows. The other remained silent, his hand resting on his belt. The situation felt surreal, and Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being targeted for no legitimate reason. Little did the officers know, Mia had already discreetly texted her husband. Jake, who was just finishing his shift at the precinct, read her message and felt his heart drop. His wife was being harassed, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He grabbed his jacket, badge in hand, and rushed to the scene. Mia, still sitting in her car, tried to maintain her composure as the officers continued their unwarranted interrogation. But the sound of approaching footsteps and the sight of Jake's unmistakable silhouette would soon change everything. As Mia sat in her car, her anxiety mounting with each passing second, the officers continued their unnecessary scrutiny. The one shining his flashlight into her car muttered under his breath, "Late-night drivers often have something to hide. You wouldn't mind us searching your car, would you?" Mia's pulse quickened. "Search my car? On what grounds?" she asked firmly, her voice tinged with disbelief. The officer shrugged nonchalantly. "Just a routine check, unless, of course, you've got something in here you don't want us to see." Mia's frustration boiled over. "I am a nurse coming back from a long shift. I've done nothing wrong, and this treatment is completely uncalled for." The second officer smirked, leaning closer to her window. "That's what they all say." Mia clenched her fists, fighting to stay calm. The blatant disrespect and intimidation were unbearable. She knew she had nothing to hide, but their tone and approach were demeaning, as if she were guilty of some crime. Just then, she noticed headlights approaching. Relief washed over her as Jake's car pulled up behind the police cruiser. He stepped out, his tall frame commanding attention, even in the dim light. The officers, initially oblivious to his presence, continued their unnecessary questioning. Jake walked up with a calm yet authoritative stride, his badge prominently displayed. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice steady, but with an unmistakable edge. The officers turned, momentarily startled by his arrival. "Who are you, and what's your business here?" one of them asked dismissively, clearly unimpressed. Jake's eyes locked onto them, his expression stern. "I'm Officer Jake Thompson, and this is my wife. I'd like to know why you've pulled her over and why you're harassing her." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence faltering. Uh, routine traffic stop, one of them stammered. We thought something seemed off. Jake stepped closer, his tone hardening. Routine traffic stop? For what? She's a nurse coming home from work. Did she commit a traffic violation? Was there any probable cause to pull her over? The officers stuttered, fumbling for a response. Jake's presence and authority had caught them completely off guard. They hadn't expected someone to challenge their behavior, especially not another officer. Mia, still seated in her car, watched the scene unfold. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a sense of safety. Her husband's unwavering stance was a stark contrast to the officer's sudden nervousness. Let me make this clear, Jake continued, his voice firm and unwavering. Harassing innocent civilians, especially without cause, isn't just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. I suggest you explain yourselves before this escalates further. The two officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado now replaced with palpable unease. They knew they were caught, and there was no easy way out of the situation. The tension in the air was palpable, as Jake's words echoed in the dimly lit street. The two officers, caught off guard by the unexpected confrontation, struggled to regain their composure. One of them, attempting to save face, said, "Look, Officer Thompson, we were just following protocol. She seemed suspicious driving around at this hour." Jake raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. Suspicious? Suspicious of what? Being a law-abiding citizen heading home from work? Or is this profiling disguised as protocol? The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence crumbling under Jake's pointed questions. One of them mumbled, "It's not like that. We just—" Jake cut him off, his voice calm, but firm. "You just what? Abused your authority to intimidate an innocent woman? Let me remind you, being in uniform doesn't give you the right to harass people for no reason. It's officers like you who tarnish the reputation of the badge." Mia, still seated in the car, felt a wave of pride for her husband. Watching him stand up for her with such conviction filled her heart with gratitude. She had endured the officer's unwarranted behavior silently, but now she could see the tables turning. The second officer, sensing the gravity of the situation, tried to diffuse the tension. "We didn't mean to cause any trouble, Officer Thompson. It was a misunderstanding, that's all." Jake's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding? Pulling over a hard-working nurse without cause, intimidating her, and demanding to search her car sounds a lot more like misconduct than a misunderstanding. Do you even realize the stress you've put her through?" The officers looked at each other, realizing they had no valid justification for their actions. They began stumbling over their words, trying to explain themselves, but Jake wasn't letting them off the hook. "You're lucky I'm handling this as a husband tonight and not as a fellow officer," Jake said, his voice carrying an unspoken warning. "Because if I were reporting this, you'd be facing an internal investigation by now." The officers were visibly shaken, their bravado completely dissolved. One of them finally said, "We're sorry, Officer Thompson. It won't happen again." Jake stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You're right, it won't. Because if I ever hear about either of you harassing anyone else like this, I will make sure there are consequences. Do I make myself clear?" Both officers nodded, their heads lowered in shame. "Yes, sir," one of them said quietly. Jake turned back toward Mia, his expression softening as he approached her car. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, leaning in through the open window. Mia nodded, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am now. Thank you." Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning back to the officers. "Apologize to her," he demanded. The officers hesitated for a moment before one of them finally said, "We're sorry, ma'am. It won't happen again." Mia didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said enough. The officers, now thoroughly humbled, returned to their cruiser and drove away without another word. Jake watched them go before turning back to Mia. "Let's get you home," he said softly, opening the door for her to step out of the car. As Jake drove Mia home, the events of the night lingered in the air like an unresolved storm. While the officers had left, Jake's mind was racing with thoughts about how often similar incidents must happen to people without someone to stand up for them. Mia broke the silence, her voice soft but resolute. "Jake, I don't think I've ever been so scared. But knowing you were there, I can't even describe how much that meant to me." Jake reached over, gently taking her hand in his. "No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not you. What they did was unacceptable, and I'll be filing a report first thing tomorrow. This needs to stop." Mia smiled faintly, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "You're not just my husband, Jake. Tonight, you were my hero." As they pulled into their driveway, Jake looked at Mia with a seriousness that reflected his unwavering commitment. "I promise you, Mia, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one else goes through what you did tonight. Sometimes, standing up doesn't just mean for the people we love. It means standing up for what's right." Mia nodded, tears glistening in her eyes as she leaned in to embrace him. The night had started in fear, but it ended with hope, a hope that justice and love could shine brighter than intimidation and prejudice.